Basically, we're a company that has built technology to integrate all the systems in buildings and then roll that up to a portfolio level to make smart building technologies work together. And we all know what smart buildings mean. You know, everybody's got that view in their head of smart, connected digital assets and that future-facing view. And it's 2020. And why hasn't that been done before now? You know, and it's actually because it's really quite hard. Smart building technologies, if you look at just one building, and if we took, you know, a smart building in Sydney, say Barangaroo, they've got 55 different systems, and none of those systems talk to each other. So if you think about smart building platforms, that's actually why it's 2020, and this still hasn't been solved. So I'll just get you to advance the slides, or am I controlling? Sorry, Julian.
Yeah.
So every building has, you know, HVAC and BMS, building management systems. Every building's got lighting and metering. Increasingly, we're starting to see smart access controls and smart elevator controls. We're starting to see lots of sensors coming into the market. And the big problem is that even within a single building, none of those systems talk to each other. And if you roll that up to a portfolio where you've got different manufacturers, different suppliers, different geographies, that problem just becomes further and further exacerbated. So if we could just advance to the next slide. Thanks, Julian. So what Switch has done is my co-founder and I actually don't come from a buildings background. We don't even come from a real estate background. We actually come from enterprise IT. And so how we've tackled this problem is on a very IT technology centric view, which is how do you do this at scale? So how do you establish connectivity of 1,000 buildings a month or 1,000 buildings a week? How do you stand those buildings up when they've all got hundreds of thousands of data points in them? How do you do that at scale? How do you apply analytics at scale? And how do you make sure that that's standardized? So these are actually really big problems to solve. And my view of the reason that a lot of these problems haven't been solved up until now is the people that have been trying to solve these problems are hardware suppliers. And they just have a completely different approach to technology, to the way that technology people would think about things. So the next slide actually talks about what our view is of the current crisis. So we've had lots of crises over the last several decades. Just in the last 12 months, we had a severe bushfire season in California, which actually caused PG&E to assess their risk. And they actually decided that it was far greater management of their risk just to turn the power off for anything up to a week at a time, rather than try and supply power through the power season. That was not so much a risk of delivery of the power, it was a risk of being sued if they caused fires. So what we saw was whole swathes of California basically with the power off for anything up to 5, 6, 7 days. And then that was quickly followed by the fire season in Australia, which was one of the worst that we've ever seen. And I think a very gigantic wake-up call to everybody in Australia that climate change absolutely is real. We had the ex-fire chiefs warning us on the sidelines that they'd been telling us about this for all year, that the governments had cut funding, and then lo and behold, it happened anyway. And then on top of that, we had Storm Dennis in the Northern Hemisphere, and then that was all followed by COVID. So our view is the current climate crisis that we're in is only going to make these crises occur more regularly and perhaps even more severe each time. And so people that are managing businesses and particularly real estate have to suddenly think about crisis management in a whole different way. And they have to think about smart building technologies as to how they're going to manage, their buildings, and how they're going to manage their teams, and how they're going to manage the health and well-being of the people that occupy those buildings. So a big part of that, we believe, is the adoption of technologies. And it just might be, as to Jonathan's point at the beginning, is that perhaps this COVID crisis is the one thing that we've been kind of waiting for to make the real estate market realise that the adoption of smart building tech needs to happen fairly urgently, and it's not something that you can just delay and delay and delay. So on the next slide, I talk about how does smart building technologies actually assist with the resilience of your portfolio, risk mitigation, and what is the ROI on that? So the obvious return on smart building technologies has always been operational efficiencies in terms of energy management and getting your building management systems connected so that you can move from reactive maintenance into proactive maintenance into predictive maintenance. What is sort of unknown to most people running large portfolios is the amount of vendor overlap. And it's shocking to me that this is not readily apparent to everybody that's running a portfolio, is that if you actually know about building management and facilities management, and if you unpack the maintenance and services part of the financial statement, you'll find that's an extremely large number. And in any large real estate portfolio, you'll find anywhere between 5 and 8 service contracts that have an enormous amount of overlap. And what you get in that overlap is a huge amount of double dipping in the expenditure. So basically you're paying people to do the same types of tasks over and over again. So one of our large portfolio customers has actually identified that they have 7 service contracts that all have overlap, and that those service contracts could essentially be rolled into a smart building platform like ours, and that they could dramatically reduce the amount of cost in those contracts. They still have the service being done, but there's a lot of the duplicated effort that is got rid of. Improving customer experience is also an obvious one and a big driver for why people are adopting smart building tech. Why would you want your customer, the person who's paying the rent, to actually be the person who identifies the problems in your building and then make them find the number to report the issue and then to report the issue so that you can then respond? An improved customer experience means using data and analytics to identify problems in buildings, particularly comfort issues. About 25% of all problems reported out of buildings are spaces that are too hot or spaces that are too cold. So, that's a very simple problem to identify. It's a very simple problem to rectify. And, really real estate owners and operators should be thinking about customer experience and doing that proactively rather than waiting for their customers to have to report that. Risk mitigation around security and access control. And now that we've got COVID, that's a whole nother area of risk. And we've seen right across the board, every conversation I've had over the last few weeks with real estate owners and operators has been, how do we get people back into buildings with the level of comfort that they need? And it's all around the data and collecting that data and then sharing that data with their tenants in a way that's really meaningful, so that the tenants understand that the real estate owners and operators are not just collecting this data, they're monitoring these spaces for the risk around disease spread and disease prevention. So that's around temperature and humidity and CO2 levels, that kind of base table stakes. Now we're starting to see people that are running spaces looking for proximity alerts, so where people are standing or sitting too close to each other, or you've got people waiting in the elevators. But the reverse problem of not being able to get people up the elevators is that you've got large numbers of people standing in the lobby waiting for their turn to get into the elevator, and so you might have proximity alerts there, density alerts, and Kezelman will talk to this in the next presentation, where we've got people coming into buildings with increased temperatures. So every single one of our clients and potential clients is talking about that. How do we collect this data, and how do we share this data with our clients so that they feel really confident coming into the building, knowing that we're across this information? And then lastly, new revenue models. So we're always talking about not just smart buildings, but making the teams smarter. And I honestly believe that the whole digitization of the entire industry. It's not just digitizing the systems in buildings, but it's actually about digitizing all of those service models. And I think there's an enormous potential for newcomers to come into the market. It wasn't the taxi drivers that disrupted the ride sharing, it was Uber. When you see outsiders come in, they can come in with a different model and something that can be easily adopted. And when you go to a digital model, those digital models are much easier to come into the market with than the labour-driven models that we currently have. So I believe that, CBRE and JLL and Cushman and Wakefield and Savills need to be totally on their game and aware that there's a lot of money pouring into this space and a lot of companies that have that potential to kind of come in and be quite disruptive with a digital model of what they're doing. So my final slide is just, this is, how we're approaching it, what Switch doing. So we're obviously collecting lots of data out of buildings and delivering those real-time alerts when your building is not performing as intended, helping our owners and operators to share that data in meaningful ways with their clients and their tenants, and then track and managing operational changes during the crisis so that you don't have to send teams out to buildings to turn buildings off or to put buildings into hibernation. So that's my chat, and hopefully I didn't go over. I'm sure I did. And I think Julian's got a poll, and I'm open for questions if anyone has any questions.
Yeah, thanks so much, Deb. Fascinating start. What I might do is I'll launch the poll, allow that to tick over in the background. I'll start with a question, but again, I would encourage everybody on the call to pique your curiosities and post any questions that you might have. So Deb, I guess the question that's at front of mind for me, I know that you've got quite kind of broad distribution of the Switch product across the US and probably in across entire portfolios. For those owners that have Switch in some assets and in others, what have you seen in terms of their ability to kind of respond and prepare differently for getting people back into tenancies as a result of having the platform? What would you say are the key insights that enable them to make better decisions about the return to space?
Yeah, so I think it's about knowing, first of all, what spaces are being occupied. If you've got a large portfolio of buildings, you don't necessarily know which tenants are returning and to what degree they're returning, and having that real-time metric around that occupancy. And really interesting, you can do that quite simply. Most BMS have CO2 sensors attached, and CO2 is actually a really interesting proxy for occupancy. So we did this crazy analysis of the COVID cases in Canada and how they rose and how the CO2 levels in the Oxford portfolio dropped. So it was basically as the COVID cases rose, and this was before the government implemented a lockdown, and the CO2 levels went down. So people were taking it upon themselves to vacate buildings and work from home well before the government brought their lockdown measures in. So I think that's first and foremost is that whole real-time insight into your operations. And a lot of buildings are being put into hibernation. And so it's about, getting those buildings back up and running. We're also starting to see the interest in bringing other data in, like when were the filters last changed? So that's actually integration with work order data. So it's really that whole thing of most of our owners and operators don't have a lot of people back in the buildings yet, but they're absolutely cranked up in terms of what's the data we need to be on the front foot sharing with our clients so that we're getting people back into buildings.
Yeah, absolutely. But later in the call, Christian, I'll be very interested to hear your thoughts from an indoor air quality perspective as well. How those insights can be enabled. David, do you have a question?
Yes, Deb. When you bring in your solution, do you generally, or do landlords then generally have to make additional investments in sensors and in other systems so that your solution can really work well, and you can get the most, or landlords can get the most out of your solutions?
For large commercial buildings, we always start with what they already have in place. A large commercial building in this day and age will already have some systems that are digital ready, whether it's the building management system or the metering or the lighting. So we try not to impose cost on our landlords on day one, because they're not using the data they already have. So we really try and encourage them to use what they've got. If you're a tenant, however, and we did a lot of work with WeWork and we're doing a lot of work with Hub Australia, often the landlords won't allow a tenant to access the BMS data. So in that case, the tenants often have to put their own sensors in so that they can understand what the landlords are offering them in terms of indoor air quality, etc. And I think this is the danger, to be honest. If the landlords don't get on the front foot and start sharing this data in meaningful ways with their tenants, the tenants will take it into their own hands, because it's, the only way they're going to get their employees back into the buildings is to have this data. And so if the landlords are not doing it, then the tenants will do it. And then what you might see is where there's a conflict between what the landlord was supposed to be providing in terms of indoor air quality and air refresh rates, etc., or comfort, and what the tenants are finding because they've installed their own sensors.
And Deb, that's an interesting point. And does your solution offer an easy way for a landlord to share some of that information? So,
yes. So we're not just with tenants. So we've built the platform in a way where, as an organisation, you might have people in your head office that need the data for all of the buildings, but the building manager that's in one building is only allowed to access the data in their single building, and a tenant in that building might only have access to the tenancy data for their tenancy. But then you might have a service provider that does all of Singapore, and so they have access to all of the data for the buildings. So we have a fairly sophisticated way of doing that whole role management.
Great.
Thank you.
I might share the results of your poll and then just get your reflections on it. So the question that everybody's responded to is, which of the following do you think will be the biggest motivator for adopting smart building technologies? Reducing costs, unsurprisingly, got about half the responses, and then a kind of spread across the other three. What would be your thoughts to close out?
Well, the crazy thing is we've always been able to reduce costs. We typically see 15 to 30% reduction in energy and at least 20% reduction in maintenance costs, and those are significant numbers. But up until now, they have not been motivators for, doing smart buildings. This year urgently, hair on fire, table banging, we must get this done. I think going into a recession changes the conversation. And I think everybody right now is not so much worried about COVID. It's what does this mean for our collective economies post-COVID? And to David's point about that, reduction in space, I think there wouldn't be too many people on this call that's not anticipating some sort of fairly severe downturn following this, and reducing costs is going to be a big part of that.
Yeah, most definitely, and I think that's critical to getting us through. So, Deb, thanks for getting us underway. I'd encourage anyone on the call that wants to connect with Deb. You can use the chat function to chat with her directly. I'm sure she'll be happy to field your questions. It's now my pleasure to.
This is Christian. Is there time for one more question, or do we need to move on?
You can jump in, Christian, sure.
We'll make it very brief. I'm interested, Deb, you've mentioned indoor air quality a few times. I'm interested to get a sense for what percentage of the buildings that you're in is indoor air quality being monitored, and how has that trend changed over your time as a company, in these buildings, and what do you think COVID's impact will be on people's interest in indoor air quality?
Yeah. So it's interesting because most people actually don't really understand what data their BMS does have available to them. Most building owners and operators know that they've got a building management system, and as long as comfort's okay, and that points back to that 25%, as long as comfort's okay, then probably, and as long as the costs are not blowing out, then no one really pays too much attention. So many more building management systems than you would think do have CO2 levels, for example. Some of them have humidity. not many. So we are seeing that you might have to supplement your BMS with humidity and CO2, but up until now, it wasn't really very many people that were interested in that part of it. Most of our customers have been really focused on the vendor management piece. How do we know that we're getting good value out of our vendors? We spend an enormous amount of money looking after our buildings. How do we know that they're actually doing that? And so they've really been focused on that piece. So I would say that piece is likely to get a real bump along. I mean, 12 months ago that this was seen as the yoga pants wearing hippie wellness movement, whereas now I think you're going to see it's really kind of an essential metric of your building is how good is the air quality.